More than 2,000 years ago, during the time of Purim, Jewish heroes emerged who led the Jewish people to victory over our enemies. Today, Machon Shilo, led by Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, has with us a modern-day Jewish hero who continues to inspire us at this time of all-out war with the enemies of the Jewish nation. Welcome and Purim Sameach, Yonathan.
Hello, Purim Sameach to you too.
Rabbi David Bar-Hayim.
Shalom and welcome to all our viewers and to my very good friend, Jonathan Pollard. Once again, it's good to be with you.
Likewise.
In these dying moments of the second day of Purim, the Jewish festival of Purim in Jerusalem. Let us begin with something which has just been very recently reported, namely the fact that the United Nations Security Council approved a short time ago a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and the United States, not true to its usual practice, abstained. What are your comments regarding to this development?
It reminded me very much of Obama's parting shot at Israel as he was leaving office, when he instructed the U.S. mission to the United Nations to abstain from a really dastardly resolution dealing with our presence in the territories. The Americans, in particular the Democratic administrations, have a very nasty habit of using the UN as a means of stabbing us in the back, simply by abstaining. Now, in this case, it may have been linked to some degree with their anger or impatience with our decision to continue on with an invasion of Rafah. From what I understand, Bibi was unyielding on this point when he recently met the Secretary of State Blinken. And so, okay, the Americans responded by abstaining. One of the reasons why people are saying in Israel, certain people are saying, we can't live without the Americans because they're the only source of real support we have in the United Nations. Really? Well, it begs the question as to what we're doing there in the first place. We shouldn't be there at all. Nor, it's ridiculous. We do not, we have less of a chance of making our case there than the poor Jews during the disputations in Spain during the Inquisition had in making the case for normative Judaism. I mean, we can't win, even with American support, which has been wholly lacking as far as this administration is concerned in the UN. So given Bibi's decision, given Israel's decision, I don't want to say it's Bibi's decision, given Israel's decision to persevere in our campaign to eradicate the Nazi Hamas movement, now holed up in Rafah or Rafah, the Americans have responded kind of petulantly and childlike by abstaining on this vote. What does this vote actually mean? Well, if you have
just to be fair and to be precise and not to be guilty of not giving all the facts, it should be mentioned that part of that decision, that recent resolution, also discussed demanded the immediate and unconditional release of Israeli hostages. It should be stated for the record.
Correct. Much ado about nothing. That was
because of course no one will hold anyone to
that. We're not talking. Nobody is doing anything seriously to secure the release of the hostages without a process that guarantees the continued survival of Hamas. That's what we have to understand. The statement concerning our hostages was added on basically as a means of protecting the United Nations from charges of indifference to the fate of our hostage. They've done precious little. There are many things that could have been done by the United Nations in the days leading up to this vote that would have given a little bit more credibility to their call for our hostages to be released. And they've done nothing, quite the opposite. So they added this just kind of as an afterthought. So here we have a situation in which the United Nations now has been allowed by the American abstention to call for a ceasefire. Practically speaking, what does this mean? Practically speaking, we will go ahead and do what we have to do with regard to exterminating the remnants of the Nazi Hamas movement holed up in Rafah. The danger here is having, let me back up. If you remember a few weeks ago, the Minister of Defense, Gallant, in Israel, signed a document demanded by the United States that Israel, we were forced to sign, that indicated that we would fight according to the rules of war, humanitarian rules of war, as a condition for receiving American arms. Okay. If you have this ruling by the United Nations for a ceasefire, and we do not abide by it, other things can happen in the international court, in the United Nations itself, and in Congress, by saying we are defying the will of the international community. That leads down the road of basically justifying that we're committed to a war of genocide against the Arabs who happen to live in Gaza. This is why this call by the United Nations, or this resolution, is so potentially useful for those people in the United States government, right, the Biden administration, and in the EU, for using it as a means of calling for an arms embargo on Israel, a comprehensive arms embargo. So the United States abstained. Okay. And other things now can happen. Look, the United Nations issued resolutions in the past about Hezbollah not being allowed south of the Litani River. And then they were never observed at all. But Dafka, watch what happens here. This resolution is going to be used as a cudgel over our heads. And hopefully the Prime Minister and the government will be able to withstand the international opprobrium that comes up from our refusal to abide by this lopsided resolution by the United Nations. I think the key thing here that we have to look at is we can't look at this resolution in isolation. We know, for example, now that this delegation of Israeli security officials that was supposed to go to the United States to discuss our plans for safeguarding the lives of the Arabs sheltering around Rafah. I call them Hamas's electorate.
Not just, I would rephrase that. They're not so much sheltering around Rafah.
They're being used.
They
as
are acting, and their presence there is sheltering the Hamas armed brigades and regiments that are situated there.
Battalions, Hamas battalions. No, the Americans have been very transparent. If you read their statements and then watch their actions, they've been very transparent in their use of these, quote, refugees, or whatever you want to call them, as human shields. So what happened with the United States, with Israel rather, in this meeting with Blinken that just took place, is Bibi said point blank, we're going to go in these are our plans. If you want to help us, fine. But we're going in. And Blinken, basically, from what I understand, refused to accept them as viable, which means nothing we could have offered the Americans in terms of safeguarding allegedly safeguarding the lives of these refugees, by getting them out of the way so we could go in and finish the job, would satisfy the Americans. So the decision was made. Why are we going to go there if we know the answer? And so we said no. And then as day follows night, the Americans abstained. They'll show us. Well, it shows you how petty they are. It's not going to do anything to stop us from going in. And I think we really have to have a discussion at the highest of levels here and amongst ourselves as well in Israel. Why are we allowing Hamas, the last remnants, the time to improve their defensive positions in Rafah? We're wasting time. We're wasting time with this whole humanitarian plot by the United States to rescue Hamas.
This is, of course, precisely what the United States has been aiming for. If the United States and others were serious about supposedly protecting what they claim to be innocence, although I claim, of course, there is the odd statistically irrelevant exception, as there were
Well, they're the outliers. Statistically, we call them the outliers.
Exactly. There are always such people. There were such people in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition, and there were
in Nazi Germany as well.
And there were people in Nazi Germany as well. But that doesn't change the fact that the United States, that Great Britain, or what have you, went to war against them and carpet bombed them into oblivion.
And obliterated cities in the process.
Knowingly and deliberately targeted so-called civilian populations. Although again, this whole concept needs to be once and for all jettisoned. This concept about the pretense that in warfare you can somehow discern between combatants and civilians engaged in a war, any war, but certainly a war for your own survival with a determined enemy. Their ability to feed their population, to continue to produce armaments, their ability to,
or even consumer goods,
anything at all. Their ability to supply the wherewithal of daily survival to their population. These are all essential aspects of warfare. Always have been. The concept of besieging a city and grinding it into the ground until they surrender because they have no food, no water, what have you. This is nothing new, and it's always been the case.
But
the Germans did it to the Russians in Stalingrad or in other places, and then in reverse, it was done by the Russians against the Germans in Berlin. They didn't offer food to the people in Berlin.
This concept is called total war, or as the Germans call it, totaler Krieg. It's total war. And it's something that we in Israel, our military, is not just ignorant of, but it's opposed to. This is the liberal mindset that you can somehow distinguish on an ethical basis the distinction between an enemy's civilian population and their military forces. Look, we all know this. Hamas was not created ex nihilo, out of nothing. It's a manifestation of Gaza and their political and genocidal aspirations to destroy us to the last child.
It's an offshoot.
Okay.
An offshoot historically of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Islamo-Nazi organization
Fascist
from its inception.
Correct.
And Gaza is Hamas. Hamas is Gaza. There is no sunlight. There's no daylight between them.
Two facts we have to keep in mind as we look at this problem with American-imposed problem with Rafah. Number one, let's keep in mind the fact that Hamas was elected with a higher percentage of support by the Arabs who live in Gaza than the Nazis were by Germans in the elections in 33 that brought them seriously into the government. Think about that. Second of all, the massacres that took place on October 7th and just the pillaging and the torture that was inflicted was not just by the so-called uniformed Nukba, the elite strike force of the Hamas movement, but by average everyday citizens of Arab citizens of Gaza that crossed the border, some of them in wheelchairs and walkers and crutches, to take part in the pillaging and murder of our people.
And this is all on tape. This is
all on tape,
documented.
And thirdly, here's probably the most important thing. There was a scientific poll taken last week that indicated that well over half, was bordering on 65% of the Arabs who are currently residing in Gaza are still pro-Hamas and are prepared to vote for them again should there be an election. That's all we need to know. We are not fighting a clean, what we called in the 18th century, a cabinet war, where you have professional armies kind of roaming around fighting one another on the battlefield. You know, we're not there. We are fighting a total war, just World War I, World War II. That's what we're fighting. It's totale Krieg. You can, under those conditions, you cannot distinguish. They're one and the same. So in this case, where we have Rafah surrounded by these human shields, okay, we're wasting our time being diverted. I don't think we're allowing ourselves to be diverted with this false concern, this inappropriate concern for the welfare of a group of people that continue to call for our genocide. And if that's the case, if you'll excuse me for saying this, I, for one reason or another, would give these people 24 hours. But when that clock runs out, we should demolish anthill, and then we'll go in and finish them off and occupy the Philadelphia corridor. The amazing thing is the United States to this day, Rav, has not said a word to the Egyptians, nor has the EU, nor has the UN, about allowing these poor, starving people, quote unquote, into Egypt for protection. So my attitude is, if they don't care about them, and the Americans and the Europeans and the UN are not doing anything seriously to protect them, I'm not going to be bound by their orders that we should somehow extend consideration to them by guaranteeing their welfare. I don't, during the Second World War, my uncle, who was in the Third Army going across France, told me point blank, if there was any resistance from a French city by German forces, the whole city was wiped out. And then they went around it and went on. And these were Allied citizens, not German citizens, but French Allied citizens. So this business right now with the Americans demanding that we somehow safeguard the welfare of these who hate us and are waiting for the day when they can repeat October 7th is such that I'm not so much insulted by it, but disgusted by it, that our government just doesn't say, look, we're not going to worry about this. We're going to take care of it. It'll be over. And if there's the blood's on your hands as well. And so
if the United States, United Nations, the EU, etc., were truly concerned about those that they claim are uninvolved, non-combatant civilians, then they would arrange for their safe passage.
There you go.
They would put pressure on Egypt, or they would somehow remove them from that area. They would do whatever it takes to remove them from the future battlefield in Rafah, in order that Israel can get on with the job of destroying the Islamo Nazis that they themselves define as terrorists, terrorist organizations, and they admit that these people have done all the things that we mentioned and many we have not mentioned. And yet they do not do any of these things because what they want is for Hamas and the so-called PA, the so-called Palestinian Authority. They wish them to join forces and establish what they wish to call a Palestinian state, which would just be Gaza on steroids.
Correct. Well, and it would metastasize, so to speak, to the territories, Yehuda, Shomron, and Binyamin. The polling, by the way, that I saw last week indicates that Hamas would probably, in a free and fair election in the PA, would displace the PA as the ruling government.
Well, everyone knows that, including the heads of the PA. That's why there have not been democratic elections there for 20 years.
Exactly. So, I mean, we're allowing ourselves to have our hands tied. We are tying our own hands because of a fiction that these people are worthy of protection outside Rafah, and that somehow we have to abide by other people's understanding of what a humanitarian war is, an understanding that they've never operated on themselves or exhibited themselves. If you look at the American army in particular, I would just refer people, if they are so inclined, to look at what happened at the Battle of Manila in 1945. There you had the capital of an allied nation, the Philippines, being held hostage by the Japanese occupiers in the city. And the Americans didn't think twice about invading Manila to get at the Japanese right through the civilians. And the butcher's bill from that battle alone was monumental. Was there an alternative? Yes. Now let's fast forward and pretend that Mr. Blinken or President Biden was then the president of the United States. They would insist that the American army stop at the gates of Manila and just run a siege line around it and make sure that the civilian population was fed adequately by the Japanese garrison. That's what we're dealing with right now. And what happened in 1945? The Americans just cut through that city like a hot knife through butter, without any consideration at all to the security and welfare of the Filipino citizens of that city. They don't really even know how many hundreds of thousands of innocent Filipino citizens died. But it was total war. And in this case, we cut through the lives of Allied citizens to get at the Japanese garrison. What's happened since then?
It should be pointed out, you and I believe you agree with me, I certainly of the opinion that the United States behaved correctly at that time. They did not have a choice. They were involved in a world war, which they had to win. They had to bring it to a conclusion as quickly as possible. That was also the rationale behind the atomic bombs, or one of the rationales behind the atomic bombs. Correct. But by so doing, they also saved many lives. The longer the war was protracted, the more protracted the war, I should say, the more people on both sides, on all sides, would die. Filipinos, Japanese, Americans, whoever. The same was true in Japan. In order to invade Japan with ground troops, the estimates between 1 and 2 million U.S. troops, just U.S. troops, would die in such an invasion. Not to mention the uncountable, innumerable millions of Japanese soldiers and non-soldiers who would die.
They were talking about genocide, that we would have to inflict it on the Japanese to really conquer them. Look, it's something people have to understand, that as far as American military doctrine is concerned, starting from the Indian Wars, the notion of total war against an enemy is something that's been inculcated in the military. The American government, through its army, basically committed genocide against the Native Americans. They did not distinguish at the time between Indian civilians, unarmed, men, women, and children, and their fighters, the braves, so to speak. In the Civil War, you had General Sherman marching through the South with one goal in mind, and that was to utterly destroy the economic and, if you will, the sociological underpinnings of the Confederacy. Yes, they met armies. Sherman met armies along the route and brushed them aside in battles. But their main concern was destroying railroads, destroying farms, destroying cities, waging war against civilians. Okay? You come up to World War II, it's the same thing. Exactly the same thing, because you were fighting a total war. In Korea, in Vietnam, and what was the famous statement, Rav, in Vietnam? It was, we had to destroy the village to save it. Yeah, well, that village had civilians in it, but it didn't matter because it was going to be denied to the enemy. And if it meant innocent South Vietnamese peasants would die, so be it. Same thing happened in Afghanistan. One famous incident where a wedding ceremony with hundreds of people was completely destroyed because, well, there was one militant there that the U.S. wanted. So they wiped out a whole wedding ceremony. And we don't even want to get into what happened in Iraq. What, 500,000 to 1 million civilians dead? That's nothing to be proud about. It's nothing to be used as a weapon to be, used against us right now in what we're doing. Most military analysts that have looked at this campaign that we've waged, in defensive campaign that we've waged in Gaza, have been absolutely astounded by the extent to which our army has gone to protect, quote, innocent people in Gaza. And I have been opposed to that from the start. This is a war of survival. And the people that we are exhibiting this concern for are the bedrock problems that we have to confront. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the grim reality of total war. So, okay, Bibi should be commended for sticking to his guns, supposedly, and not sending a team to Washington to discuss our ideas for removing the Arab civilians, quote unquote, from Rafah before we went in, by rejecting the American notion that we should fight this in a more pinpoint way by sending commando groups into a hornet's nest where they would be sure to suffer casualties, which is what the Americans want. And by basically telling the Americans, we will do what we have to do to win this war. And that if you don't like it, then go ahead and abstain from a UN vote that doesn't mean anything to us anyway.
I join you, Jonathan, in commending, on the one hand, Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, for refusing to send that delegation to the US, which would have been a travesty and a national embarrassment and disgrace to begin with. And yet it must be noted that Netanyahu, perhaps for the first time in my memory at least, is acting as he is in fact behaving because he has no choice. In terms of his political survival, I don't know how long he thinks he might continue as the Prime Minister of Israel. He's, after all, 74 years old. He's been the Prime Minister longer than anybody else of this country.
Bad heart.
Around, I think, 16 years, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish him well in terms of his health. I don't believe he doesn't strike me at all as infirm or incapable of continuing. Not at all, I must say, to his credit, both physically and mentally, I believe. I think I've always said this. It doesn't matter who's in that office. To be the Israeli Prime Minister is probably the most difficult job on the planet.
I call it a poison chalice.
It is. It is a terrible position to hold in many ways. Although many of Netanyahu's problems, and therefore our problems over the years, have been self-inflicted.
100%.
But in this case, Netanyahu is acting in such a manner because he has no choice. He knows, first of all, that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, at least I would say 85% of the country, probably over 90% of the country, supports his refusal to buckle under American pressure. The entire country, again, with a few statistically relevant exceptions, understood that it was absolutely essential and necessary to enter Gaza, the Gaza Strip, with the Israeli army, with boots on the ground. That's necessary to, as Netanyahu claims, to disband and bring about the disintegration of Hamas, which I don't believe is possible, by the way. I don't believe the way the war aims were defined by Netanyahu and his cabinet. I do not think they're achievable, but at least that's his claim. And everyone understood, almost everyone understood, this is necessary. And he will completely, he will bring about his almost immediate political demise if he were to act in any other way.
As we've discussed, he's probably the most committed analyst to polls, the smartest interpreter of polls, I'll put it that way. So to the extent that the polling supports what he's doing, he will continue with it. Let's not, deny the fact that if the polling were ambiguous or were somewhat clouded in terms of what the country wanted, he too would reflect that. The issue with him right now, I think we should distinguish between what he's doing now and what he proposes to do the day after in Gaza.